My phone lit up at 11:47 that night with a bank alert I was never supposed to see. $18,500 charged through a luxury cruise agency for a trip to Switzerland. My name is Kelsey. I am 32 years old, and I work as a senior compliance officer for a major cruise line in Chicago, which means I know exactly what unauthorized identity usage looks like. But nothing prepares you for seeing your own father's name, Gary, on the invoice for a dream vacation you weren't even invited to. Have you ever felt like an outsider in your own home? Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. I didn't reach for the phone to call my father. I didn't want to hear his practice excuses or my mother's soft, disappointed sigh. I didn't want to be told that I was making this a whole thing when they were the ones who had made it a crime. Instead, I reached for my laptop. The blue light from the screen hit my face, reflecting back a version of me that was finally done being the backup wallet. This wasn't a family crisis. It was a compliance breach, and I was the one in charge of the investigation. First, I locked the primary credit card. One click, and $18,500 of my money was officially out of their reach. I didn't stop there. I went into our travel rewards portal. My father had been using my points for years, like they were his own inheritance. There were over 300,000 points in there, all earned from my late night flights and business meetings. I saw the pending reservation for a luxury suite in Lucerne. I canceled it immediately. Then, I changed the password and the recovery email. The most insulting part was the employee discount. Gary had used my internal staff code to get 50% off the entire tour. In my industry, that is a fireable offense if the employee isn't traveling. They weren't just stealing my money, they were risking my career. I sent a high priority email to our internal booking desk. Unauthorized usage of staff code for the Gary Whitman party. Please flag as fraud and cancel all associated reservations. I went through every shared account, the streaming services, the airport lounge membership, even the grocery delivery app. I removed Gary and Stephanie as authorized users. I updated the security questions to things they could never guess. Not? What was the name of your first pet? But what is the exact amount of debt your family owes you? The total was $96,000 over the last 4 years. I saved that figure as my new master password. It felt like a shield. I sat there in the silence of my bedroom, watching the login attempt notifications populate on my phone. My father must have been downstairs, trying to check the itinerary or add an extra excursion on my dime. Every alert was a reminder of a boundary he didn't think I had the nerve to set. He was probably confused, wondering why the family card wasn't working. He had no idea the foundation of his perfect vacation had just vanished into thin air. I didn't feel the familiar knot of guilt. For the first time in 4 years, the air in my lungs felt clean. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for far too long, footing the bill for a club I wasn't allowed to join. As I turned off my phone and laid back against my pillow, I realized that my compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years. Tomorrow morning, the bill was finally coming due. I stared at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom, the one my father still called mine, even though I paid for the new windows and the heating system that made it livable. In the darkness, my mind started running through a different kind of itinerary. Not one with scenic views and chocolate tours, but a balance sheet of every time my loyalty was sold back to me as a debt. For 4 years, I'd been the silent investor in Gary's version of a family. And tonight, I was finally looking at the dividends. They were non-existent. There was the emergency roof repair in Chicago 3 years ago, $4,200. My father had stood in this very hallway, looking at the water damage, and told me that, as the only child with a real career, it was my responsibility to keep a roof over our heads. He promised to pay back half. I never saw a single cent. Then there was my mother's specialist appointment, and the medications insurance wouldn't cover. I didn't even hesitate. I just handed over my card, believing that love meant being the person who catches everyone else when they fall. But looking back, I realized they didn't just want me to catch them. They wanted me to be the floor. The most painful memory, the one that finally snapped the last link of my patience, was my grandfather's watch, a vintage Patek Philippe. It was the only thing of value he had left. I was the one who took him to every chemotherapy session. I was the one who held his hand in the hospice wing, while Gary was too busy managing his failing consulting firm, and Trevor was out celebrating another almost business deal. On his deathbed, my grandfather whispered that the watch was for the one who stayed. But the moment the funeral ended, Gary took it. He didn't give it to me. He handed it to Trevor right in front of my face. A family legacy needs to stay with the firstborn son, he'd said. Trevor didn't even look at me. He just strapped it onto his wrist and asked what time the wake started. My father wasn't preserving a legacy. He was rewarding Trevor for simply existing, while I was penalized for being capable. People often ask why someone like me, a woman who identifies fraud for a living, would let her own family rob her blind for years. It's hard to explain the invisible chain of the survivor. You see, when you grow up in a house where love is a currency you have to earn, you become an expert at paying. You tell yourself that if you just cover one more bill, or if you're just a little more useful, eventually the balance will shift and you'll finally be family instead of just a resource. It's a psychological cage without songbird bars. You stay quiet not because you're weak, but because you're trying to survive in a dynamic where your value is tied to your availability. I had been translating their disrespect into stresses or misunderstandings because the alternative was admitting that my family viewed my career as their collective inheritance and my personal success as their unlimited credit line. I wasn't just being a good daughter. I was trapped in a subscription of emotional blackmail where Gary was always the one holding the remote. The air in the kitchen the next morning was thick with the scent of expensive dark roast coffee and the even heavier stench of a lie that everyone had agreed to call the truth. Gary sat at the head of the table in his silk navy robe, his thumb flicking across his phone screen with the rhythmic confidence of a man who believed he owned the world. My mother, Stephanie, was humming a soft tune while pouring cream into the best mom ever mug. I had bought her 3 years ago, a piece of ceramic that now felt like a satirical monument to my own stupidity. My younger sister, Destiny, came in next, wearing designer sunglasses indoors, already talking about the crisp alpine glow, as if the sun itself required a visa to look at her. Trevor and Claire arrived 10 minutes later, their rolling suitcases rattling across the hardwood floor I had paid to refinish last spring. They were staying over before the big airport run, their faces glowing with the kind of excitement that is only possible when someone else is footing the bill. I sat at the far end of the table, my tea untouched, watching the cracks in their house of cards begin to show. The first one appeared when Gary frowned at his phone. It was a small, sharp twitch of his eyebrow. He tapped the screen again, then again, harder this time. Gary, my mother asked, her voice dipping into that placating tone she reserved for his moods. The hotel says the VIP suite upgrade didn't process, he grumbled, his jaw tightening. Probably just a security hold on the family card. I placed my mug down gently, the click of ceramic against wood sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. There is no family card, Gary, I said. Every head at the table snapped toward me. The silence was instantaneous and heavy. My father's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping an octave into a low, dangerous warning. Kelsey, not now. We have guests. Don't make this a whole thing. A whole thing, I repeated, the words tasting like iron, is planning a $35,000 tour of Switzerland without me and expecting my card to carry your luggage. This was a trap of normalized cruelty, a psychological mechanism where my family didn't see themselves as thieves. Over 4 years, they had convinced themselves that my success was a communal asset and that my boundaries were an act of betrayal against the greater good of their comfort. They weren't upset because they had stolen from me. They were upset because I had made the theft inconvenient. Claire looked between us, her face flushing with the realization that she was an accessory to a crime she hadn't quite understood. Kelsey, please, my mother interjected, her eyes filling with those practiced, manipulative tears. Your father has been under so much stress. This trip was meant to bring us all together. Don't be so selfish. I'm not being selfish, Stephanie, I said, standing up. I'm being documented. I filed a dispute for the $18,500 you charged last night. I removed every authorized user. Any charge you try from this point on will fail. The silver jumped on the table as Gary slammed his palm down. You will unfreeze it right now, he roared. For years, that roar had made me shrink. It had made me transfer thousands of dollars I needed for my own future, just to stop the noise. But today, the sound hit a wall of cold, hard facts and bounced off. I looked him straight in the eyes and said one word: no. I didn't wait for Gary to find his voice. I didn't stay to watch my mother's tears dry into resentment or to hear Trevor's latest theory on why I was the problem. I picked up my laptop bag, walked out the front door, and didn't look back. As I pulled out of the driveway, my phone began its predictable, frantic dance in the cup holder. Gary called 11 times. Stephanie called 7. Trevor sent a text that simply said, "You better fix this before Claire's parents hear about it." It was almost funny how they still thought my priority was their reputation rather than my own bank account. By the time I reached our downtown office, the adrenaline had settled into something much more useful: professional precision. I work in compliance for a reason. I know that in the world of facts and figures, whoever has the better paper trail wins. And my paper trail was a mile long. I found Natalie Brooks in the break room. She took one look at my face and set down her tea. Natalie wasn't just a colleague. She was a sharp financial lawyer who understood exactly how family ties could be used as garrotes. We moved into a small, private conference room, and I laid out the digital evidence: the $18,500 charge, the staff discount code breach, and the 4-year history of unpaid loans totaling $96,000. "This isn't a family squabble, Kelsey," Natalie said, her eyes scanning the spreadsheet I'd compiled. "Using your corporate credentials for personal gain is a felony level breach. And the unauthorized use of your credit card? That's identity theft." We didn't waste time on emotions. We focused on the strike. Within the hour, a formal notice was drafted. It wasn't a text message sent in anger, it was a professional demand for restitution. I formally notified the travel agency in writing that the charges were fraudulent and that I would not be responsible for any remaining balance. Then I sent a PDF to the family group chat. It contained a comprehensive breakdown of the $96,000 they had siphoned from me over 4 years, with a clear 30-day window to initiate a repayment plan before I took the next legal step. The silence in the chat lasted exactly 4 minutes. Then the panic hit. My phone didn't just buzz, it screamed. Gary's text shifted from angry demands to frantic questions about how they were supposed to pay back money that was already spent. They weren't shocked by their own greed. They were paralyzed by the sudden lack of a safety net. Natalie watched the alerts flash across my screen and gave me a small, satisfied nod. "They aren't arguing the facts anymore," she said. "They're realizing the resource has run out." Natalie and I spent the rest of the afternoon in a specialized search of my personal financial history. As a compliance officer, I knew that if a person is comfortable stealing from your credit card, they've likely been stealing from other places for a long time. We weren't just looking for misunderstandings anymore. We were looking for the rot. I found it buried in a set of archived documents from 3 years ago. It was a trust fund notification I never received. My late aunt, Sarah, had left me an education and development fund worth $50,000. Gary had remained a co-trustee on the account since my 18th birthday, a lingering legal tie I had naively neglected to sever out of a misplaced sense of family trust. According to the terms, I was supposed to have full access to it when I turned 30. I am 32. I opened the withdrawal history and felt the air leave my lungs. The entire $50,000 had been drained in 2 large installments. I pulled up the scanned images of the withdrawal slips. There was my name, written in a cursive that looked almost exactly like mine, but the K was too sharp and the Y didn't loop quite right. It was a masterpiece of forgery. And the funds hadn't gone to an education account. They had been transferred directly into a business holding company owned by my father. I sat back, my hands hovering over the keyboard. Natalie leaned in, her eyes hardening as she saw the signature mismatch. "Kelsey, this is it," she whispered. "This isn't just about bills. This is a criminal offense." A further search of public business filings revealed exactly where that money had gone. It hadn't saved my father's business. He had pumped the entire $50,000 into a real estate investment group managed by Trevor. It was the same investment Trevor had bragged about at family dinners while I was paying for our mother's medication. The project had collapsed within 8 months. My aunt's legacy, my future security, had been gambled away on Trevor's incompetence by the man who called me a worthless burden at breakfast. The $96,000 in loans now felt like small change. This $50,000 theft was the kill shot. Gary hadn't just used me as a backup wallet, he had actively scavenged my life to feed Trevor's failures. I didn't feel a breakdown coming. I didn't feel the need to scream. I felt a cold, clinical detachment that replaced every remaining ounce of daughterly affection. For years, I had stayed in that house because I believed family was a bond you don't break. I had been a good daughter because I thought they were just struggling. But you don't struggle your way into forging a signature. You don't struggle your way into stealing $50,000 from your own child. This wasn't a family drama anymore. It was a criminal case. Gary had bet on my silence and my sensible nature for 3 decades. He thought I would always be the one who stayed, the one who paid, and the one who understood. But he had forgotten one thing about my job in compliance. We don't negotiate with fraud. We prosecute it. I looked at the forged signature on the screen one last time and realized that the man downstairs wasn't my father. He was just another fraudulent transaction I needed to flag. I could have frozen their world with a single email from my office, but some audits need to be delivered in person. I wanted the confrontation to happen at the check-in counter, at the very threshold of the luxury they thought they had stolen from me. The terminal at O'Hare International Airport was a sea of moving bodies and mechanical announcements, but I could spot my family from 50 yards away. They were standing near the Swiss International Airlines check-in counter, surrounded by the 3 rolling suitcases and the garment bag I had seen at breakfast. Gary was at the front, his face a deep shade of crimson, leaning over the marble counter and gesturing wildly at a gate agent who looked like she was counting the seconds until her shift ended. I walked toward them slowly, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. I wasn't running. I wasn't hiding. I was carrying a single manila envelope that contained the end of Gary's 30-year reign as a family patriarch. "I'm sorry, sir," the agent said, her voice amplified by the professional boredom of someone who has heard it all before. "But this entire reservation, the flights, the land transfers, the hotels in Lucerne, has been canceled by the initiating agency due to a reported payment fraud." "Fraud?" Gary bellowed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I am Gary Whitman. This is a family emergency. My daughter simply made a mistake with the card." "The only mistake Gary made," I said, stepping into the circle of their chaos, "was thinking I wouldn't file a police report." They all turned. Stephanie gasped, her hand flying to the throat of her travel trench coat. Trevor looked like he wanted to vanish into the floorboards, and Claire stepped a full yard away from him, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. Gary didn't apologize. He didn't even look ashamed. He pointed a shaking finger at me and snarled, "You ungrateful little brat. You've humiliated us in front of everyone. Do you have any idea what this looks like?" "It looks like an audit," I replied, my voice calm and lethal. I opened the envelope and pulled out the police report and the forged withdrawal slips from Aunt Sarah's trust fund. "You didn't just steal $18,500 for a boat ride. Gary, you forged my signature to drain a $50,000 legacy." I watched the illusion of the empty wallet shatter in real time. For decades, Gary had used his position as father to demand respect, but that power was never inherent to his character. It was a suit of armor he had rented, using my bank account. Now that the funds were gone, the armor had vanished, leaving only a desperate, dishonest man standing in the middle of an airport. His authority didn't exist without my credit limit. "Please, Kelsey," Stephanie whispered, her voice finally breaking. "People are staring. Let's just go home and talk." "I don't have a home here anymore, Stephanie," I said, handing the file to Gary. "My lawyer has pre-drafted the confession of judgment inside. It's clean, airtight, and includes instructions for a legal notary. You have 48 hours to sign it, or I move forward with the criminal charges for forgery and identity theft." "This isn't a family talk, Gary. It's your only exit before the handcuffs." "And if I don't?" Gary asked, his voice losing its volume, turning into a hollow, jagged rasp. "Then I stop talking to you," I said, "and I start talking to the district attorney. Your choice." I turned and walked away before he could answer. Behind me, the mechanical flight board flipped, the clicking sounds marking the departure of a life I was no longer willing to live. I woke up the next morning to the sound of Lake Michigan instead of Gary screaming. My new apartment isn't large, and the windows don't face the Alps, but every square inch of it is paid for by a woman who no longer answers to the name useful. On my nightstand sat my grandfather's Patek Philippe watch. I had found it at a local pawn shop 2 days after the airport confrontation. Trevor had surreptitiously brought it there to pay for a down payment on a sports car he thought would impress Claire's parents. I bought it back with the first installment of the $150,000 Gary had been forced to transfer to avoid a felony indictment. The trip to Switzerland was officially canceled, and the family group chat has been silent for weeks. Trevor's engagement collapsed within 48 hours of the check-in disaster. Claire realized that marrying into a family that builds its vacations on identity theft was a liability she couldn't afford. My mother still sends birthday cards, but they are empty now, no money inside, and more importantly, no guilt written between the lines. I've come to realize that there is a profound difference between the justice of punishment and the justice of the seed sower. Revenge usually focuses on the fire, on watching the house of the person who hurt you burn to the ground, but true justice is what you plant in the ashes. I didn't just take my money back. I used my victory to build a life where I am the primary passenger, not the payment method. If you find yourself in a similar situation, always remember that family isn't determined by blood. It's determined by dignity, kindness, and how we choose to treat one another. Letting go of a toxic bloodline isn't a betrayal. It's a necessary act of self-preservation to find out who you really are when you aren't busy being someone else's resource. To those of you who have always felt like you're standing at the edge of your own family, waiting for a permission to be celebrated that never comes, you don't need their seat at the table. You are allowed to build your own table, in your own home, with a card that only you control. If you were in my shoes, would you have pushed for the full criminal prosecution, or is the piece of a clean break enough for you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to share this if it resonates with your journey.